The format is going to be, I'll talk for 20 or 25 minutes on these themes, and then we'll have discussion. And Josh wants us to be wrapped up by 1:30, which I don't think should be too much of a problem. But I'm actually happy to talk in the discussion about issues that arise out of the talk, but indeed anything else that you want to talk about. I'm a historian primarily, and so that's why in the talk I'm going to talk about what I know about, which is the history of this issue. But I'm aware that there are contemporary elements of the question that are also quite pressing, and we can talk about those as well. But one of the reasons I'm interested in the history is because I think once we understand the history of science and religion and the history of the relations, positive and negative, between science and religion, it really gives us an important angle on where we're at today. So my interest in the past is not merely an academic one, but it's one that to some extent is motivated by a desire to understand better where we're at today. But I'm going to talk about the origins of this modern myth about a conflict between science and religion, and I'm going to do this in 4 sections. I'm going to start with where we are today, and it seems to me that although the idea that science and religion in the past have been in perennial battle, that's what I call the conflict myth. The idea that science and religion in the past have always been involved in a conflictual relationship, and that they've been involved in a conflictual relationship because of essentially the kinds of enterprises that they are. That I think is historically and demonstrably false, but nonetheless there are areas of conflict today, and I'll start by talking about those. But then I'm going to go back and look briefly at 2 of the kind of emblematic instances of past conflict, and just explore in a little bit more detail why I think they're not instances of conflict and why they're not in any sense emblematic, and they're the cases of Galileo and Darwin. And then I'm going to talk about the area that I've worked in mostly, which is the religious origins of science, how science would not have come into being in the West had it not been for religious considerations. And then we'll talk a bit about possibilities of harmony, and then we'll hand over to you. So let me start then with the question of modern conflict. And I think modern conflict between science and religion arises in a number of areas, but there are really two really key sources. And the first is up here, the 4 horsemen, so-called, or the new atheists. And I'm guessing you're familiar with at least some of these. Going from the left, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, at the far right, Daniel Dennett, and then in the second from the right, the late Christopher Hitchens. And these guys are advocates of atheism, but more than that, part of what they argue is that the reason for their atheism is that science has shown that religion is either unnecessary or that it's false. And for them, there is a necessary conflict between science and religion. And more than that, they think religion is undesirable, and that science for them is the weapon that they can use to demolish religion. So for them, in a sense, the conflict is one that's inherent. On the other side, we have a conflict between creation, or some conceptions of creation, and evolution. And that conflict historically originated in this country in the early part of this century. But, and I used to think actually that it was a peculiarly American phenomenon, but it is not. It is increasingly a universal aspect of contemporary conflict between science and religion. And so we see in many countries, and not merely Christian countries, in Islamic countries as well, a notion that evolutionary theory is incompatible with fundamental tenets of religious belief. So between these two sides of things, religious opponents of evolutionary theory and the new atheists who argue for an incompatibility between science and religion, is the argument that contemporary science and religion are necessarily in conflict. Now, of course, it's worth saying that the conflict between evolutionary thinking and elements of religious thinking is only a tiny part of what science entails, but nonetheless, from that particular conflict, we get extrapolated the notion of a generic or general problem of science and religion. And I'll give you some examples now about how that's worked out. So Richard Dawkins, I'm guessing, is a figure that you're relatively familiar with. He was for a time Professor of the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford. In fact, we overlapped at Oxford. Interestingly, he has not been for many years a practicing scientist, and that his scientific publications are relatively few, but he used his platform not to promote the public understanding of science at Oxford, but rather to promote a view about an inevitable conflict between science and religion. And I'll just offer you a typical statement for why he thinks it's the case. Religion, he says, is just bad science. And the second part of the claim, don't fall for the view that science and religion operate in separate spheres or are concerned with separate kinds of questions. Religions have historically always attempted to answer questions that properly belong to science. Okay? So there's a number of elements to this, and it's worth teasing out a little bit. But the key thing is that for him, science and religion compete for the same kind of explanatory territory, and that religion is really a primitive version of science. Religion is trying to answer the same questions that science answers. The difference is that science gives the right answers and religion gives the wrong answers. And there might have been a time in the past when religion was good enough, but that's no longer the case now. So his whole idea is that science and religion compete for the same explanatory territory, but science is much better at explaining that stuff. And so science properly should displace religion. And then the historical claim there is the last one, that religions have historically always tried to compete with science. And it's that last part that I'll contest. Interestingly, the middle claim about science and religion operating on separate spheres was something I'm sympathetic to. This is actually a dig at Richard Dawkins' old enemy, who is the evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould. And Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Dawkins have a long-standing conflict about the mechanisms of evolutionary change. Richard Dawkins is a huge advocate of natural selection. That's now a fairly unfashionable view. Stephen Jay Gould, probably don't need to go into the details of this, promoted something genetic drift and had a much rather different version of the mechanisms of evolutionary change. But Stephen Jay Gould also famously said that science and religion occupy separate, what he called magisteria. So he argued that they were independent. They sought to answer different kinds of questions, and for that reason conflict was unlikely, or at least unusual. And Richard Dawkins is also claiming that that's not the case. So let me give you a second example. Here's Sam Harris, who's also one of the new atheists. And I'll just give you a couple of quotes from him. The first one from an article called "Science Must Destroy Religion," just in case you're wondering what that article was about. The clue is in the title. But the conflict, he says, is very nearly zero-sum. So what he means by that is, whenever religion has a victory, it's a defeat for science, and whenever science has a victory, it's necessarily a defeat for religion. You can't have both. So the maintenance of religious dogma always comes at the expense of science. And then in another version in the Huffington Post, it's time that public intellectuals and scientists got on the right track here, and then a specific critique of people like Francis Collins and Kenneth R. Miller, who he says are doing lasting harm by the accommodations they have made to religious irrationality. So here's the idea that science personified by reason and that Christianity or religion is personified by irrationality. The problem with this view, or the problem that Francis Collins and Kenneth R. Miller confront for this, is that Francis Collins is perhaps the most prominent scientist in this country. His scientific credentials are impeccable, and yet he's committed to the Christian faith. How can this be? Major problem for Sam Harris and the gang. Kenneth R. Miller, similarly, a committed Catholic. He's the author of probably the most widely used biology textbook in colleges and schools, and yet is so committed to evolutionary theory, but nonetheless, as I've said, a committed Catholic. So these guys exemplify in their very existence a problem for people like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. Harris doesn't offer many arguments, but there we have it. And I'll just give you one more, not one of the new atheists, but Stephen Hawking, a very prominent scientist, and it's the second quote that I want you to have a look at. That's the one that's most important, that there's a big difference between science and religion, because religion's based on authority and the science is based on reason, and then a prediction, science will win because it works, so there's a conflict between science and religion. So why do people think that there's a historical conflict between science and religion? Because people like this say there is, and that they point to some contemporary examples of conflict between science and religion. They say that science and religion try to answer the same questions. They say that science is based on reason and religion is based on irrational faith. Okay, so just to see what then are the hot button issues if we look back at the history of science that might confirm this view, and I'm going to give you a quote from an Australian newspaper from some time ago, but here is a report about debates concerning evolutionary thinking, and you can read those for yourselves, I won't read them out. But the key points that crop up again and again in these conversations are these hot button issues. Evolution, the idea that medieval thinkers supported a flat earth, and then the Catholic Church's condemnation of Galileo. So most important, I think, in supporting the claims about historical conflict between science and religion are the historic instances of Darwinism and the Catholic Church's trial of and condemnation of the teachings of Galileo. I'm going to skip those. That's just another example of how Galileo and Darwin are taken to be emblematic of historical conflict between science and religion. So what I'm going to talk about now, very briefly, I'm going to look at Galileo, I'm going to look at Darwin, and then I'm going to talk on the positive side of the scale about what I'm going to speak about in more detail tonight, the religious origins of modern science. But here's Galileo, interestingly in a 19th century depiction of a trial. Basically the story with Galileo is Copernicus in the mid-1500s came up with a theory that suggested that the Earth went round the Sun. The Earth was not the centre of the solar system. The Sun was, and the Earth went round the Sun. The Catholic Church wasn't much bothered by this. But 60 years later, in 1616, the Catholic Church told Galileo he was not to teach or defend that theory as a true theory of how things are. Galileo published a book that kind of did. It was a dialogue between two people, right? And one's putting the case for an Earth-centred, and one's putting the case, well, there are three of them, but one's putting the case for an Earth-centred, one's putting the case for a Sun-centred. And the one putting the case for the Earth-centred is a bit of a dill, and the one who's putting the case for the Sun-centred is really smart. So the Catholic Church weren't fooled by this. And so in 1632, they said, Galileo, we told you in 1616 not to teach this, you have. So, famously, as we know, he had to recant. So the issue is this in fact a paradigmatic case of a conflict between science and religion? And I'd suggest it's not, and there's a number of reasons for this. But the first reason is that the Catholic Church, in supporting an earth-centred cosmology, was actually endorsing the scientific consensus of the period. That no one, or hardly anyone, was supporting the Galilean position. All right? There might have been, in the year 1600, historians say there were fewer than 10 people in the whole of Europe who thought that you could make the case for a sun-centred solar system. So what you've got here is a competition between two competing scientific views of how the solar system operates, and the Church is supporting the scientific consensus. There was considerable scientific evidence against a sun-centred solar system. For example, you couldn't observe stellar parallax. You couldn't see changes in the positions of the stars. Don't worry if you don't follow that, but we would expect to see changes in the stars' positions if the Earth was in motion. That was not detected until the 19th century. Galileo's evidence was based largely on telescopic evidence. Who had a telescope? Galileo. So there was not public evidence available to support the position. Galileo had an argument for the motion of the Earth from the tides. Completely false, completely wrong argument. So that it was a very complicated situation, and it wasn't a case of science versus religion, but competing scientific versions of the solar system, and the Catholic Church, imprudently perhaps, backed what was a strong scientific consensus at the time. The other thing that we can say is that Galileo made the mistake of attempting to support his view with citations from Scripture, in fact relying on Augustine, very subtle arguments about how we use Scripture in relation to science. But in doing so, he was actually behaving like a Protestant, because it was the Protestants who claimed to be able to interpret Scripture for themselves and not rely on the authority of the Catholic Church and the Fathers. So what he was in effect doing was claiming an authority to interpret Scripture, which is what the Protestants were doing in the context of a post-Reformation Europe. This was a big mistake. So that's why the Catholic Church weren't too bothered with Copernicus, because it wasn't such an issue even at that stage. So to cut a long story short, this was not a case of science-religion conflict. It was something else. The other question we'd say is, if it wasn't science-religion conflict, was it typical? No, it wasn't. It was not typical of the Catholic Church. It was quite anomalous. And in fact, John Heilbronn, who's written a very interesting book about cathedrals as solar observatories, makes this remark, that no institution in Europe supported the study of astronomy to the extent that the Catholic Church did for these 6 centuries, from the later Middle Ages into the Enlightenment. And in fact, the Catholic Church still has astronomical observatories all over the world. So, to cut to the point, is the Galileo incident a classic case of science-religion conflict? No, it's not. It's not about science and religion, and it's not a typical thing. So it can't really be emblematic of historical change. Moving on to Darwin, and look, Darwin's a tricky case, because there are aspects of evolutionary theory that on the face of it cause genuine problems for elements of traditional Christian faith. But that said, when Darwin puts his theory forward, there's a similar issue, that there's a conflict with contemporary science. So to give you an example, Lord Kelvin, who was the leading physicist of the period, estimated that the Earth was only 20 million to 200 million years old. Pretty big interval, right? Pretty big margin of error. But based on thermodynamic principles, this was his calculation. It was not long enough for evolution to have taken place. So that there's opposition to evolutionary theory based on scientific grounds. There is considerable opposition, I must say, also on religious grounds. But Darwin had a number of religious supporters. Here's Charles Kingsley, for example. He's the author of The Water Babies. It's a loftier view of God's creation. Asa Gray, who is Darwin's chief American supporter, professor of botany at Harvard, and a good Presbyterian, if there is such a thing. I think there is. Sorry, there may be Presbyterians among. So there is such a thing, obviously. But it is a higher version, he says, of creation than what we've had before. And just a couple more. Henry Ward Beecher, another famous American family, designed by wholesale is grounded and designed by retail. So the situation with Darwinism is a bit more complicated, right? But my point here is that it's not a straightforward case of conflict between science and religion. Okay. Now look, I've got some material here about the conflict myth, but let me go to that. Why then, if these two instances, as I've said, are much more complicated and they're not emblematic, where does this idea about a conflict between science and religion comes from? And one reason I think is to do with a particular history about a particular view about historical progress that says in the West we move from religious to a scientific view, and that religious views are outmoded. And again, this goes back to Richard Dawkins' notion of the fact that science and religion are attempting to answer the same kinds of questions, but that it's science that does it much better than religion. Inevitably then, science will triumph. So this is just a French guy called Auguste Comte who argues for these famous stages in history. But this was a kind of standard view in the 19th century, and this view of progress is what informs the views of the new atheists, that religion is something that should be consigned to the past, it's a relic of a primitive mindset, and what we need to do is to get our heads into a scientific rationality. And then most famously, the idea of a conflict between science and religion is invented in the 19th century. So no one talks about science and religion conflict before the 19th century. And this historian, well, he's not really a historian, he's more a chemist, I think, John Draper, chemist and amateur historian, that's called him, says this is what we see if we look back in history. The reality is that we've got two contending powers. That's what science and religion are. And then Andrew Dixon White, who's the first president of Cornell University, again writes this famous book, The Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. In history, we see this conflict between two epochs. So, although we've got Galileo and Darwin happening before this, no one talks about a conflict between science and religion until we have these guys. And interestingly, no one really talks about science and religion much before this period. If we search for the phrase science and religion in English books, what we see is this increase from the late 1700s into the 20th century. And for the most part, from about 1880 onwards, the discussions about science and religion put them in conflict with each other. Okay? So no one thinks that there are these two entities, science and religion. No one thinks that they're in some eternal conflict until the 19th century. So that's where we see the myth emerging for the first time. And I won't go into the reasons in any detail, but what I want to do is to take just a few minutes to give you a concrete picture about historical relations between science and religion. And that's to do with the religious origins of science and the fact that we wouldn't have science in the West at all were it not for religious considerations. And I'm just going to give you a few examples, and we can talk in more detail at the end if we have to. But here's the general question, and as I say, I'll talk about this in more detail in the lecture this evening, but why is it that modern science starts in the 17th century and it starts in the West and we don't see it anywhere else? Why is that? And we don't see it in China, although China has an incredible technology. We don't see it in Islam, although Islamic science from the 9th to the 15th centuries is also really something. Never takes off, but it does take off in the 17th century in the West. Why is that? And my answer as a historian to that question would be it's actually to do with Christian ideals and institutions that make it possible for science not merely to get started, but to be firmly embedded within the culture in a quite unique way, and now it's exported from the West to everywhere else. But just to give you a few examples, Robert Boyle is a key figure in the scientific revolution of the 17th century. You might remember him from Boyle's Law, right? okay? But he's a very important chemist. And here's his view about why we should be doing science, because it's, for him, the first act of religion. It's philosophical worship of God, and performing science, doing science is in fact an intrinsically religious act. So he's motivated, like many others of the period, motivated to pursue science because he sees the study of nature as something that's inherently religious. So not only does he see no conflict between his scientific activities and his religious convictions, but he sees his religious convictions as being a key part of what's motivating him to study nature. Perhaps the only English scientist of the period to compete with Boyle in terms of fame is this man, Isaac Newton. And again, we find a very similar view expressed by Newton, who says that this image of the cosmos that we have, the most beautiful system that he has described in his famous book, The Principia Mathematica, could only have come from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being, that is, God. And he goes on to say that, it's a bit of a complicated phrase here, but concerning God, to discourse of whom from the appearances of things does certainly belong to natural philosophy. But natural philosophy reads science, okay, and what he's saying is it's a part of science to talk about God on the basis of what we see out there in the world. Okay, so sometimes people think that in the Middle Ages we have science and religion all mashed up together, and they come apart in the 17th century when science comes onto the scene. That's not the case. In fact, if anything, the opposite is the case. In the medieval period, science and theology were relatively separate. They come together at this period when science is starting to take off, and this is a good case of how they come together. Newton and Boyle both saying that religion is a key part of what gets science up and running. Most crucially, the idea that there are laws of nature that we can understand is a theological idea. That it's a theological idea. So Boyle, for example, says the laws that we the regularities that we see and that we express as laws, like Boyle's law, they're not intrinsic to nature, but they're imposed upon nature by God. So the idea of a law of nature is a new idea in the 17th century, invented by the French philosopher Descartes, who has a similar view. The laws of nature come from God, who legislates. He makes laws for the creation, and scientists study them. When we discover these mathematical regularities, what we're discovering is divine laws. And the only reason we would think nature would be lawful in this way is because God has put them there. Okay? Probably don't know this guy. I haven't got his name up. This is Samuel Clarke, who's probably the most able theologian of the early 18th century, but he's a Newtonian. He carries on a very famous correspondence with the philosopher Leibniz about various Newtonian things. But he gives another statement of this idea of laws of nature. The course of nature is nothing else but the arbitrary will and pleasure of God exerting itself and acting on matter continually. And part of what motivated this understanding was the nature of gravity. When Newton postulates the existence of gravity, this attractive force that's, as you know, inversely proportional to the distance between objects and directly proportional to their mass, Newton has no conception of what this force consists in, and ultimately the view is that it's God consistently working in this mathematically regular way to ensure that bodies move the way they do. Laws of nature, in other words, are just God acting continually. So when we study the laws of nature, what we're doing is we're studying God's actions in the world, and God's actions always have this regular pattern. So to sum that bit up, this is a colleague of mine at Sydney, but he says, I think what's exactly right. It's not that science breaks free from religion in the early modern period. Its consolidation depends on religion being in the driving seat. So why religion takes off in the West when it does is because of these religious considerations.
Now, I should say that Stephen Gaukroger has no religious convictions of his own. He's not pushing any particular barrow. This is just how he sees it as a historian. Okay, very quickly then. Science and religion in harmony. I just want to give you a counterpoint to the guys we looked at right at the beginning, and some thinkers who think that it's not going to be all conflict. Science and religion, says Stephen Jay Gould, we've mentioned him, occupy different spheres, and these spheres don't overlap. And if you buy that, and I'm not suggesting you have to, but that's certainly one way of suggesting that science and religion are never going to come into conflict. John Polkinghorne, who I think we know, a very famous, well-known figure in science and religion discussions, a physicist who then became an Anglican clergyman. But science and faith are two eyes, he said, two ways of looking at the world. We get a much better view if we have them both. And the atheist's idea about the world just happens to be there is really for him a very impoverished view of how things are. I'll give you one more. Language of God by Francis Collins. One of the great tragedies of our time is the impression that science and religion have to be at war. They were not in the past, that's for sure. They do not have to be in the present. And one more, and then we'll wrap up. Simon Conway Morris. I don't know if you know this guy. He's a paleontologist at Cambridge. Worked on the Burgess Shale with Stephen Jay Gould, so he's an evolutionary biologist. But here is his claim. It seldom seems to strike the ultra-Darwinists, and he's talking here about people like Richard Dawkins, that theology has its own richness and subtleties and might actually tell us things about the world that are to our real advantage and that we don't ever discover by science. Okay, so I've talked for a lot longer than I'd hoped to, so it's going to be your turn, but to wrap it up, for most of history, science and religion have not been in conflict. Religion plays a positive role in the origins of science. The idea about an enduring conflict was an invention of the 19th century, and in recent years, the reason we have this idea of conflict has gained momentum is because of these two factors: religiously motivated resistance to science, which is undoubtedly there, and then crucially claims from a minority of scientists that science disproves religion in some way. But to finish up on perhaps an unlikely note, I'll give you a couple of quotes from Darwin. Darwin says, you can be a theist and an evolutionist, and he's never been an atheist in this sense, says Darwin in 1879. And then again, he hardly thinks that they can be kept distinct. So he's not a Stephen Jay Gould kind of person, but he doesn't think there's any reason for the disciples of either school to attack each other with bitterness. And that's probably not a bad note on which to end.